Thank you for tuning in to this episode of August 69. Scott Michaels is the owner of LA's dearly departed tours, the writer and host of the popular documentary 6 Degrees of Helter Skelter, and a technical consultant on Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. In this exclusive interview, Michaels discusses the people and the locations that continue to reflect the Helter Skelter saga in the Los Angeles of today.
Doing what I do for as many years that I've done it, I've run into several people that sort of surprised me. There were, there's a lot of people that live here that, I went horseback riding on the ranch. I remember George. I remember seeing the hippies hanging out. Everyone's got one of those stories here. It's almost like a stock story. It's almost like the fictitious party at the Tate House that night with, I could name about 20 people that claimed they should have been there that night, but they got called away for some reason. It's sort of become a running joke with me because I just collect those stories, and I have documents and clips from books filled with all those. But in reality, because of the 6 Degrees of Helter Skelter, the documentary we did, people have gotten in touch and said my mother, my father, etc. But a couple of the really curious ones was Virginia Graham, who was in prison with Susan Atkins, and it was between Virginia Graham and another prisoner named Ronnie Howard that the two of them together from different places went to the authorities at the same time and sort of broke the case. See, Virginia's got a great story. She wrote a book, and I would highly recommend it. It's called Manson, Sinatra, and Me, and it was the story of a party girl in L.A. and she hung out with the likes of Sinatra, etc. And she was in prison for parole violation. She'd been around the block. I mean, she was a very classy lady, but she's got a little bit of a history, and not in a horrible thievery kind of way. But she was part of a lot of parties, etc. So Virginia was in prison at that point for parole violation for floating a bad check. And Susan Atkins was brought in, and she said, "Here's this little girl, this little baby-faced girl, who's all of 19 or 20, doing cartwheels in the middle of this little dormitory that we're in." And she kept talking about, the murders and this groovy guy named Charlie. And Virginia's a smart lady, and she's like, "Girl, you better keep your mouth shut," because she figured she was full of it. You're going to get nothing but trouble by mouthing off like that. And she continued, and finally Virginia got fed up and said, "Okay, describe the house to me." Now, Virginia had looked at the house. She had been to the house before when she was looking for a place to rent. So she knew what the inside of the house looked like, weirdly enough. And Susan Atkins said, "Well, when you walk in the front door, there were these beams." And Virginia said, as soon as she said beams, I knew she was telling the truth. But I'm not going to be the one, because snitches get stitches. She didn't say that, but she's basically, a smart person in prison keeps their mouth shut. So she told Ronnie Howard, another prisoner who happened to be married to Virginia's ex-husband, and said, you might want to pal up to this chick because maybe you'll make some reward money if this is legit. So ultimately, Virginia was transferred to a different prison. And, the Manson girls, they would do anything to stay relevant. They would do anything to stay in the news because they wanted to bring attention to the way Charlie was being mistreated. So they were crawling on their hands and knees for the news crews across Sunset Boulevard, and they were just doing anything. They were breastfeeding each other's babies in front of the courthouse, even though some of them didn't have babies, and knitting a vest out of their own hair. It was a freak show. And they started sending out a hit list. I'm going to kill Tom Jones, Susan Atkins says. We're going to have sex, and as soon as he's about to climax, I'm going to shoot him in the head. And they were going to kill Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and pop out her eyeballs and cut off his dick and send them all to Eddie Fisher. I mean, now we laugh about it, but back then it was scary. And they said they were going to hang Frank Sinatra upside down and skin him alive and make purses out of his skin. And Virginia, who was transferred to another prison at that point, said, "Now I have to say something because Sinatra's my buddy." So Virginia, at the same time as Ronnie Howard from different prisons, went to the authorities, and they're the ones that broke the case. But Virginia kind of sat in the back, and Ronnie Howard kind of stood up and did the did the talk shows, et cetera, after the murder. So
yeah, and she does have a fascinating story. And there's also you did an on-camera interview with her that's up on your YouTube page as well, I believe.
Yeah, it's 90 minutes. I mean, it's uncensored. So she was very kind. I mean, she's a really classy lady. She's in her mid 80s, and she's dresses beautifully every day, and she's so soft spoken and well spoken and just kind. And so she was so generous to let me do that. And there was nothing that wasn't touched upon in the book that I couldn't ask her about, and other things too. So yeah, that interview in its entirety, I think, is pretty interesting. Look into her life, and then through the other avenues, the gentleman, somebody who got in touch with us, was his father had given Manson a moving violation. He's CHP, California Highway Patrol, and he gave Manson a moving violation the day before the murders. And originally when Manson was charged or arrested with the murder, not charged yet, but arrested, Manson claimed he was up north in Sacramento at that time. And it was this officer's citation that blew Manson's alibi. And the officer, although his name is misspelled, I believe, in the book Helter Skelter, had never been asked before. And his citation was all needed, so he wasn't brought into the trial either. But just sort of people, as you were saying, sort of on the periphery, that have those little fascinating tidbits of information. It just completes the story and gives it more of a human aspect instead of these creatures in black and white photos that you see.
Yeah. And speaking of Helter Skelter, have you heard a lot of pushback against that book and the theories it presents?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Helter Skelter is the truth of the trial. That is exactly how the trial went down, and the end. Helter Skelter, Mr. Bugliosi did what he needed to do to get Manson convicted. I don't know, in retrospect, 50 years later, or it's 49 or 48 years now from the trial. But in retrospect, I don't know if the avenues he pursued would be permitted. But I do think that he did what he had to do. One thing stands out is that one of the co-prosecutors was Stephen Kay. Stephen Kay went on a date with Sandra Good. That alone should have taken him off the case. For some reason, it wasn't. And I find that questionable. And I do think that the way Manson was treated might be considered by some people questionable. As Mr. Bugliosi's capacity in that trial was to get a conviction. And that's what he did.
Yeah.
But Helter Skelter, that's just nonsense. Helter Skelter's nonsense. It may have existed on a small level. Manson was a blowhard. Manson would, he had a captive audience that he kept captive, and he could spout off his grocery list, and people would listen to him and take it as gospel. So, but no, Helter Skelter is a bit. I think most people realize that it's not really what was going on here. But it's not as interesting as revenge and drug deals. Much more interesting to paint it as a horror movie.
Well, do you think that kind of those far-fetched theories that he presented in the book, do you think that's one of the big reasons why the story has survived over the past 50 years? Kind of that fiction fable that he built around it? Certainly,
because it is a horror movie, and it had real movie stars in it and real rock stars in it, and a beautiful pregnant lady who happened to be married to one of the most successful directors of the time. So that alone, and adding into that Rosemary's Baby, Sharon did a movie called Eye of the Devil. They did The Fearless Vampire Killers. Anton LaVey, The Church of Satan. They were on the scene at the time, but the real thing to remember in all this is that we only got news twice a day back then, and a daily newspaper. So the imagination aspect of this was out of control, because up until that night, you thought you were safe in your own bed, and whatever the philosophy behind it was, it doesn't matter, because for 4 months no one was charged with that murder, and everyone thought somebody was going to come crawling in their windows and kill them while they slept, and that scared the hell out of people.
I've heard that a lot from people that first of all, the time period. It was a time in our country's history of such enormous change and a sense of revolution, and there was a sense in the culture already that things seem like they might be about to get bad. But they really did. The people that I've spoken to really have talked about, that night it changed because everyone had kind of an open door policy until that night. And then people for the first time started
everyone looks on it in retrospect like it was such a beautiful time. Nobody remembers syphilis. Nobody remembers people robbing you that when those doors were open, hey, come on in, and nobody, somebody went through my shit and stole my purse, the stinky, greasy hair, and nobody remembers all of that stuff. It's just all the rose-colored glasses and the beads and great music, and I prefer to focus on that too. Or I like to focus on that too, but it is literally rose-colored glasses. And the '60s, they were, there were other things that happened after this. Woodstock, something wonderful happened a week after the murders. So there were other things that were going to happen in the '60s after the murders. But up until that point, hippies thought they could trust each other, I guess, and it wasn't the case anymore. And now the killers were these cute little faced kids who were sitting on the corner saying, "We're coming after you next," and carving shit into their heads. And yeah, so it changed innocence. But I think innocence went with Kennedy personally, but certainly Manson tied it up with a bow, and he was a very convenient boogeyman.
There's an interview with William Tennant from this new book Chaos, and the author even released an audio clip of the interview with William Tennant, and he talked about the innocence of the time and how it ended that night. And Bill Tennant said, "No, we weren't that innocent. It wasn't that innocent."
Yeah, I listened to that, and I'm about halfway through that book right now. But it wasn't all that wonderful. It was debauchery. It wasn't crazy. I don't know. Maybe it was people hanging from the ceiling. I don't know. But there wasn't the judgment that we have now, and also AIDS wasn't an issue back then. People overdosed probably, but the drugs were good, and they weren't cut with speed. Cocaine wasn't cut with speed, and speed was good, and it just all that has changed now with manufactured drugs, etc. So there was an element of debauchery back then, but. It was fascinating is that the press turned on these victims after a while, and were making it seem like it was their own fault because there was nothing else to report. So they were focusing on the fact that Roman and Sharon had a sex tape, or that there was some drugs found at the scene, and that was unfortunate because it was Jack Nicholson said it that they had Sharon had the misfortune of being murdered twice, the first time by her killers and the next time by the media, by the press. So it was unfortunate.
LA is such a constantly evolving city. From one year to the next, it's just changed so much. And I know that a lot of us are very sad about that. But you do a Helter Skelter tour, and you stop by a lot of these sites that are important to this saga. And I'm wondering, what are the sites in particular where you can still get that tactile sense of that time and place?
Well, it helps to be, we're in an enclosed vehicle, so although I'm in traffic and I'm the one that's driving and I'm the one that's sort of orchestrating this audio, video, experience, you can kind of close your eyes for a moment when you're on the Sunset Strip, and you open them, and on the screen is a picture of the Hyatt Regency back when it was still the Continental Hyatt. What is now the Comedy Store, which was originally Ciro's, was called It's Boss. And I've got a great picture with the Love and Spoonful on the marquee, and you're actually listening to the Love and Spoonful, so you're kind of going to the whiskey and hearing people like the Doors and Green Tambourine and things like that, Incense and Peppermint, Strawberry Alarm Clock. I love that. And it is going down the strip, you kind of get lost in that a little bit. And also the bits of trivia, the Ben Frank's, which was a restaurant where a lot of people used to hang out, and where, showing pop culture stuff where John Lennon would have breakfast, and that's where the Buffalo Springfield met for the first time in the parking lot. So you're kind of dipped into the era a little bit. And when we go up to the La Bianca house, for instance, I've assembled audio of the killers describing the crimes. So I'm not telling you what's happening, they are. And it's in their own words, and you'll hear Leslie as we're standing in front of the house saying, we went into the house, Tex went in first and came out, and, I took Mrs. LaBianca into the bedroom, et cetera, et cetera. So it's they're telling the story with regards to the awful parts. And when we'll go up to Cielo Drive, well, the house is long gone, but I've got photographs of the house from exactly where we are at that point, and there are other houses on that street that were there at the time. So you can kind of immerse yourself into it and at least see where things were. It would be perfect if everything was there still, for me, but time has moved on, and unfortunately people don't have that sense of history like I do, and I don't have the money to preserve it. So while we're going, up Benedict Canyon, I'm explaining what was happening in the car to them at that point, how Krenwinkel and Atkins were changing their clothes in the car, and Krenwinkel was complaining about the handle on the knife, pinching her, etc. And by the time we finished with those stories, we're at the street where the Webbers lived, and you can see where they grabbed the garden hose and went out to the middle of the street, and so it's all blow by blow, and to where the clothes were thrown off the cliff and where the gun was thrown. And I interviewed fairly recently the young man who found the gun, and at his home, or at his old home, and that was pretty fascinating. So yeah, it's the story, and sometimes in their own words, and I've assembled it the best I can. And we do touch on the pop culture aspect of it. We do go into Laurel Canyon, and we do talk about, the wandering from house to house, and the John Phillips Young Girls Coming to the Canyon, and Mama Cass's house, and, just a half mile away from Mama Cass's is Wojciech Frykowski and Abigail Folger's house. And Abigail Folger and Wojciech, they're unfortunate victims. Of Wojciech Frykowski had ran with unfortunate people, and et cetera, et cetera. So I can go on for hours about this, but so that's what I try to do. I try to let people experience it the best they can without actually traveling back in time.
Right, and you do such beautiful work. You are the best at what you do. Adam and I both feel that way about you, and I got to tell you how influential you've been, because you started in this field before everyone else kind of jumped on your bandwagon. Because a few months ago, as you know, because we came to visit you, Adam and I were taking a trip to L.A., and one night we drove up to the Los Feliz murder house, and we saw a car pulling out of the driveway and passing us very, very slowly as we were approaching the house. And they were looking at us, and we could hear them saying something in the car. And I was thinking, those must be new owners or something. I don't think they want people prying around this property. So before we get in trouble, let's take off. So we drove from there to the La Bianca house, because they're relatively close to one another. And that same car was parked in front of the La Bianca house. And they rolled down their window, and they said, "Are you guys death hags too?" So, your influence is out there, man.
That's cool. That's really cool to hear.
Well,
the case is so bizarre. Just when you think you got it figured out, someone throws you for a loop. This Chaos book is like, whoa. Some of it I'm kind of hesitant to jump on the bandwagon with, but some of the things he brings up are crazy. The fact that President Nixon commented on the trial was just outrageous, and nothing the president would say isn't contrived at that point. Back in the 60s, it's contrived, I should say. They don't just speak off the cuff very often. And so Nixon to say, here's a guy who is obviously guilty, and it's like, whoa, while the trial was going on, and he almost threw the trial. And I find that fascinating, what O'Neill, brought up about the end of the 60s and the people protesting the war, and we all know there is money in war, and the fact that he was able to prolong it for a while by for whatever reason. But O'Neill's theory about Manson being a symbol of the counterculture and getting people to sort of reject young people who were the ones who were objecting to the war. That was a fascinating. It never made sense to me why Nixon did that, and somebody actually put that together. I found really interesting.
Yeah, I really thought it was a fascinating book, and just the fact that he has conversations with people like Terry Melcher makes it worth the read to me, because he's been working on it so long that he actually caught up to these people before they passed and got them on record. Makes it invaluable to me, that book. It gets progressively loonier as you go along.
I know. Well, the fact that he's saying that Melcher was at Barker Ranch, I still can't go on board with that one. But that was in Bugliosi's own handwriting, so I can't say it's O'Neill's fault, because I recognize Bugliosi's handwriting, but I don't know. Sometimes it just here we are, 50 years later. My God, talking about it still and learning more information.
Still arguing about every single detail and rethinking of And what's fascinating to me is the thought that Manson returned to the house. I mean, do you think that that's likely that he returned to the house that night after the murders?
Personally, no way. I no. Manson was not a brave person. Manson was not a brave person, and we know for a fact that at least a half a dozen people in Benedict Canyon called the police that night, and reporting gunshots and screams. The lady next door heard the gunshots, though she didn't. Parent was killed 50 yards or 30 yards or whatever it is outside her front door. So the odds of it could have been that. There could have been police up there in 2 seconds. So no, I don't think Manson was going to drive the 45 minutes from Spahn Ranch and go back and manipulate the bodies. The only evidence of there being something strange is the blood outside of the house that they say that belonged to Sharon Tate or Jay Sebring, that is outside the front door. It's an odd. I can't explain it either. But if their theory is to be believed, Manson picked up Sharon Tate, not leaving a single drop of blood between her and the front door, and putting her down, and then changing his mind and picking her back up without leaving a single drop of blood and putting her back. It doesn't make any sense. The way it's portrayed, the other option somebody said I heard recently is that Sharon was actually killed on the front porch. I don't believe any of that. Yeah. The police screwed up a lot. We know that. Who's to say they didn't mislabel the blood? We know Wojciech Frykowski ran out the front door. So maybe the blood was mislabeled. We know they lost the gun. We know they didn't find the clothes until December after Susan Atkins confessed to it, or her confession was published in the LA Times. We knew there was an eyewitness in Benedict Canyon that read it in the newspaper that said, hey, that sounds like me. So that was 4 months after the murders happened. So who's to say? But Manson was too much of a coward to go back. No way. I don't think so. I will argue that till the cows come home. No way.
Well, yeah, it's a fascinating side investigation, and it's covered in the Greg King book, too, who I know that you're familiar with. And I think that's a beautiful book as well, just in terms of bringing Sharon back to life in a way. Greg
was nice. Greg was a good guy. He kind of disappeared because for some reason, he came out relatively unscathed. But people that put themselves forward as I guess an expert would not be quite the word I'd want to use, but an authority on the case are attacked by all sides by people that claim they are. And there are 5 or 4 Manson groups out there, and they all hate each other's guts, and they go after each other, online. And it's a very much you may know a lot, but if you think you know more than me, I'm coming for you. So they're on attack. Right. I know, I've got it on a light level, but yeah, people are nasty. The internet has made the world an ugly place.
On the next episode of August 69.
still kind of a culturally defining moment, I think, and I think that's why people are so intrigued by it.
Journalist Tom O'Neill spent 20 years investigating the inconsistencies and lies behind Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter narrative. In our exclusive interview, he discusses the revelations contained in his new book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, including the lengths taken by Bugliosi to achieve his convictions.
The whole trial was called into question because it was fixed from before they were even identified as suspects.
And the secret tapes that might lead the way to more victims.
And we're sure that they still exist.
Absolutely not.
Tune in to the next episode of August 69. Visit MovieGeeksUnited.net for more details.